we've got two items. We've got the notice of motion from Councillor Johansson with respect to city care, and I think, as I've said on a couple of occasions already, you know, we've got a new council. There isn't a lot of background, you know, in terms of the history behind the significance and engagement policy, which we're required to review every 3 years through our LTP process, and in terms of what constitutes a strategic asset. So so instead of the report just talking about the requirements around consultation, the suggestion is that the resolution also refer to what constitutes a strategic asset for the purposes of the significance and engagement policy. And then I think, picking up on some of the points that were made in the presentation before, what obligations arise from being a strategic asset as opposed to being a significant asset that isn't on that list? What difference does it make? And I think that's going to be quite a useful report for generally. But I do want to mention the next item, which is the item in relation to enable, because that one I've actually gone back to, and you might have guessed that from the questioning that I put forward in relation to enable. And that is that I've rather than look at it from the point of view of it having been raised as a matter in the annual plan last year, I've actually gone back to the original decision, and that was in relation to the long-term plan. And in the long-term plan process, we certainly were very clear about being able to proceed with sales without going back for a further consultation, that the LTP process was sufficient to support the sales that would occur. Enable was explicitly excluded from that because there was no intention to sell any shares. In fact, we said we couldn't even contemplate that until 2021. So I would much rather than get into a detailed discussion about what makes an asset strategic or not, in the absence of a paper that gives us that opportunity to really consider what is strategic and what isn't. Come back to reinstating enable to the list of strategic assets contained in the Council's significance and engagement policy on the basis that the Council decision to remove it could be considered to be inconsistent with the consultation document, which precluded any consideration of selling any interest in enable until at least 2021. And that way, it's not referring to the annual plan consultation, it's actually going back to the very beginning. And then we can have a conversation as a council about what is a strategic asset and what's not. And we can do that off the back of the paper that will come back to council as a response to Jana Johansson's notice of motion. Well, there's more than one. So if Councillor Johansson, are you happy for those two additional criteria to go into your notice of motion?
Absolutely, that's fine, and I'm also happy to support enable coming back on strategic assets.
Okay, so do we want to deal with the total together, or do we want to deal with them separately?
I prefer them dealt with separately.
Okay, all right. So if we could, I think that you want them voted on separately, or should we deal with them separately? Because I think way they cover both issues. Yeah.
Well, whichever way you want to.
Okay.
I just don't view city care as a strategic asset, so
but we're not having that discussion today.
No, I understand that.
What we're doing is we're asking for a report that talks about what constitutes a strategic asset for the purposes of the significance and engagement policy, and then all of the other issues.
Yeah. Okay.
So the decision on city care, I will vote for this notice of motion. I think this is a good way forward, and it enables the real issue around The difference between being a strategic asset and not being a strategic asset gives us an opportunity to thoroughly debate that in the public arena, which I think is a good thing to do. The reason that I want to take the what I think is a decision that could be challenged, the original decision to take it off the strategic asset list, I'd much rather reinstate enable as the basis of that decision not being one that could be, well, it could be challenged. I'd rather put it back on the strategic asset list, and we can have the debate some stage in the future, you know, when we discuss what's a strategic asset and what's not. So we're not discussing whether enable's a strategic asset or not, we're discussing reinstating it to the strategic asset list so that we can start from scratch in that regard. Yep. Right, so they're two separate things. So, Yanni, you would like to move your notice of motion. So do I have a seconder for that? Glenn, well, Glenn got his hand up first. And so do you want to just deal with that first, or do you want to deal with the two of them together?
I'm happy just to deal with two of them together in the interest of time.
Okay, so I'll come to my wording, which I will move my wording. Do I have a seconder for my wording? Andrew? That was sight unseen, yay. Good call. All right, so now does anyone have any questions of Ian in the meantime? Because if not, I'll just move straight to debate. Andrew?
So the only question I have is the timing around the report back on City Care and the ability for the discussion that Leanne referred to on what is and what isn't strategic. Mm-hmm. How quickly are we likely to be able to get that report back?
I'll just refer to my colleague, Lynn and Connie, down the bottom.
If I said before the end of the year, is that enough time? Because we still have a few things to do, either that or, well, gosh, we're in November now, aren't we? So, and the last meeting before Christmas, I think, is the 15th.
Yeah.
So what if I undertake to bring it back to you for consideration at the meeting of the 15th of December?
Yep. No, that's fine. I mean, you need the time it takes we all need the time it takes to do this thoroughly so that we end up with the right answer, having gone through a good process. So if that's the time it takes, then that's the time it takes. Thank you.
But
I won't guarantee.
Just a point of clarification, if Councillor Johansson's motion is lost, does that mean that City Care status remains where it is, or is that still challengeable?
Even if it's one, it stays with us.
Yeah. In both instances, it stays as it is. But I think the chances of it failing are pretty low. Just saying. Yep, cool. Right, so any more questions? So the notice of motion doesn't change the status of City Care. It asks for a report, which we have now been told will be reported to the meeting on the 15th of December. So could we have that in there? No. Oh yes, meeting to the council meeting on the 15th. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the purpose of the report. I mean, I've made it clear that I don't support the reinstatement of City Care to the strategic assets list, but, you know, that's a discussion that we can have. Yeah. But I'm still going to support the notice of motion because it's asked for a report around a number of details, and I think this council, new council, has to have a discussion about what constitutes a strategic asset and what what obligations arise from the classification of an asset as a strategic asset. Right? So, Yanni, would you like to start off the debate?
Yeah, thank you. So, as has been noted, this is calling for a report. We've got a report in front of us, but I appreciate that we've got new councillors who don't know the full history of what's happened in terms of the City Care sales process, in terms of that capital release process, and also are significant an engagement policy. So I actually do think it is prudent to ask for that additional information to come back to strengthen that report, so that when we make a decision, all councillors can feel comfortable with a level of knowledge about it. My personal view is that now that the sales process in terms of the offer was not accepted, the sooner we can give certainty to the fate of City Care, the better. And if it's putting it back on the strategic asset list, then I think that's a good thing to do. But again, I appreciate that people want more information. So I think the other point that comes through in the report is, and that's really the crux of D, an assessment around whether or not previous consultations we had sufficient information. So what you find in the report was that both the consultations in 2015 and 2016, the majority of submissions on the proposed capital release program opposed council giving up ownership control of its strategic assets, at which time City Care was a strategic asset. And again, it's also said in our report, a decision to return City Care or Enable to the strategic asset list would reflect the views expressed by the majority of submitters. So, I think if we wanted to, we could do it now, but people want further information, and that's fine in terms of City Care. In terms of Enable, I just think the way it was taken off, certainly I don't think people were clear in terms of that consultation document. And I think it's really important, given that we had deputations or submissions through our annual plan this year, that we respond to the submissions that we received. And we had submitters saying, please put it back on the strategic asset list. And therefore, I'm more than happy to do that today, because I think that's a really clear response to submissions. And I just think Enable is a hugely important asset for our city, a strategic asset. And we should actually list it on our strategic asset list. Now, as the point has been made, that doesn't stop you from selling off the assets, but what it does is it actually gives the community and the public a level of, I think, confidence over if anything's going to be done, then there is a degree of public consultation and engagement that would have to occur, and it's a higher threshold in terms of having it on that list than not having it on that list. So I can't see any reason why we would not put it on the list. And if we need to deal with it in the future, then we can deal with it, and so forth. So I'd like to move these notices of motion, and I think the additional one around Enable, it is two quite separate issues, I think, but fundamentally, as part of the annual plan or the draft annual plan, councillors will need to approve another or make amendments to the significant and engagement policy. So I think it's timely that we get the information back by the end of the year. Then that can inform the draft annual plan, and we can go and have a conversation with our community if we need to.
Very good. Raf.
I'm very supportive of this. I think clearly Enable is a strategic asset. It's a piece of core infrastructure for the city. I'm also supportive of the motion around City Care. I don't think it is a strategic asset, but I think it's important for the public to be able to have a conversation and actually understand more about what is strategic and what isn't. And I remember in the course of the last term doing a couple of public sessions with people about the capital release program, and a lot of people came up to me and said I wasn't aware that was the case, or I didn't know that, or I didn't understand it. So actually, the more conversations we have with the public about these assets, the better decisions we'll be able to make in the future.
Jamie.
I would ask that it sounds like you're putting them separately, and that's good. So I will be supporting the motion to reinstate Enable to the strategic asset register, for the reason that, just as Raf said, and I believe why you're moving this is that I believe it is a strategic asset. It's a tricky question when you ask someone, what makes a strategic asset strategic, and obviously. The notice of motion here is going to, in part, answer that. But my view is that a strategic asset, it's not limited to, but it's generally a piece of key core infrastructure monopoly. And what makes the strategic asset strategic? In my view, it's an entity in which our shareholding assists our city achieve its wider goals. So our seaport, our power port, our data port, all of these, I see as very strategic. So I will be supporting Enable being returned to the strategic asset register. Is there disruptive technology that exists? Absolutely, but I think there's a good chance that disruptive technology, it's guaranteed, will always be invented. but it has to plug in somewhere. So if you're talking about data, it doesn't matter how wireless you go, unless you can find something that's faster than the speed of light. I always see fibre being relevant. As far as asking the question of what effectively constitutes a strategic asset, I won't be supporting that, because I just see no point in spending time and money trying to answer a question that I already know the answer to. A contracting company, in my view, is not a strategic asset. Simple as that. So I can't see why we're going through the motions and spending valuable resources just to entertain someone that wants to, in my view, make political points. So I think it's a nonsense, and I won't be supporting asking that question, but I will support the Mayor's move to reinstate Enable to the Strategic Asset Register. Thanks.
Yeah, Jimmy was next.
Thank you. I support this one. Main reason is this one, request the staff report the sufficient information to us in the December for further discussion. Okay, that's totally consistent with the significance and engagement policy. If we today make a decision, probably inconsistent with the policies. That's the first point. Secondly, regarding the Enable or the city care list, in December we might have the debate and then make a decision. But sometimes because different view. However, I was impressed. Last week they invited to the city care AGM. I was really impressed. Their client satisfaction last year and this year 61, 70%. Even staff satisfaction 74 and 77. And also health safety quite good and healthy. So it means that even under the situation, under council control, but still good and healthy, and also create the net profit. But it's not main purpose here. The main purpose, this is more inconsistent with the policy. So I support this one. Thank you.
Andrew, Dion, Glenn.
I'll deal with City Care and the notice of motion first. And I think it's important that councillors focus on the matter that we're actually considering today. The matter in front of us today is not whether City Care is a strategic asset or whether it's not. The question in front of us today is, do we want to have a report so that we can have a sensible, informed debate about that? And I think it's important to note that we've got a number of new councillors around the table who haven't been part of the previous discussions around what constitutes a strategic asset and what doesn't. And I also think there's some history around, conversations about City Care that we had in the last council term that need to be socialised and need to be known by those new councillors, so that there isn't an asymmetry of information or even a lack of information around the table that feeds into what needs to be a sensible, informed and measured debate. And it'll be great to have it in public about whether City Care in fact is a strategic asset or not. But that's not the question we've been asked today. The only question we've been asked to deal with today is whether we want a report, in my view, to allow that sensible, informed debate. And I'd be surprised if that wasn't supported, to be honest. On Enable, I certainly agree with the approach been taken, and I'll be supporting, obviously, the motion put in front of us today. There's an interesting comparison between Orion and Enable, and if Orion is a strategic asset as a reticulator of power, then surely Enable must be a strategic asset as a reticulator of information, data, and fast information and data at that. So I think if we needed to get into a substantive debate about whether Enable was strategic or not, there's one clear answer. Again, the way that the motion's been put today, we're not needing to get into that debate, and I certainly agree with both the process and will be supporting that outcome.
Dion?
Just want to say thank you to the people who presented before, but also thanks to the council for giving us the opportunity, or giving me the opportunity to understand a little bit more about what actually is a strategic asset, because I'm not 100% sure, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people in our communities who do not know. So I think as we learn, or as I learn, I think actually we can actually take our communities along that journey as well, because Enable is quite clear-cut about being strategic, from what Councillor Turner just said before, but the Red Bus and the city care are not as clear-cut, and I'd like to understand a little bit more about those before we can actually make decisions on what happens to their future. And as of what Councillor Johansson said before, about giving those companies some certainty about moving forward, we need to make sure that the people that are working in those organisations do have some very good, clear instructions about what they're doing into the future, because we are moving into a period of our recovery and our regeneration where we do need to have some certainty about what's going to be happening with our infrastructure and our transport systems and those sort of things. So I think in these conversations that we need to have about what is a strategic asset and how that actually contributes to making our city a good place, I think bringing our communities on board with us on those conversations will be really important. So thank you.
Very good. Glenn?
Okay, thank you. Just partly in response to my friend and colleague, Councillor Jamie. I actually would spend a bit of time and money on this, simply because we are a new council and we have 5 new councillors. We did, in the previous term, spend considerable time gathering all the financial information which we needed for people to arrive at over their decision making, and I think it's not only political, there's some other considerations as well, and we need that wider context. So I know you might have your view on that, I totally appreciate it, but I think for the new councillors, in all fairness, it would be good to provide that wider context. This seems to me a reasonable move to support having a report so that we can at least come out of the starting blocks with the same information and have a level playing field. So I would support us doing that. And with enable, yes, no question, being strategic.
Very good. So I will put the first, the notice of motion from Councillor Johansson. I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
So the noes are Councillors Gough and East.
You might want to change the
You
name
change the
tags,
names.
by the way, Jim.
Oh.
You're Jimmy East at the moment, and you're David Chin. Yeah, I was wondering how long it's going to take you, but you know.
Is that how you were sitting before? Because is it set up that way for the voting?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it was just the name tags that were wrong. You don't know who you are. That's carried. Anyway, the next item is item 21. I'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. And that was seconded by Andrew Turner. Yeah. Right, so the next item on the agenda is item number 20, which is the resolution